High in the frozen peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, a crumbling mansion stood abandoned for 30 years, its windows black with ice, its halls silent as a tomb. The townsfolk called it cursed, a place where no one survived the winter. It was here that Elena arrived with her young daughter, cast out by her own family, with nowhere left to go. On their first night, as she pried open the frost-sealed door, her daughter tugged at her sleeve and pointed to the grand fireplace. Behind the ice-covered stones, something was hidden. Documents that revealed the mansion's true heir, and a secret powerful enough to destroy the very family who had disowned her. Why had this place been abandoned? What truth lay buried beneath decades of ice? And would restoring this frozen tomb bring Elena redemption or seal her fate forever? The bus pulled away with a groan of diesel engines and a cloud of black exhaust, leaving Elena and her daughter Lily standing alone on the cracked concrete platform of the small Appalachian town's only bus station. The cold was immediate and merciless, cutting through their thin jackets and settling into their bones with a permanence that spoke of the harsh winter to come. Elena clutched Lily's small hand tighter, feeling the tremor in her daughter's fingers, a tremor that matched the one in her own heart. The town of Cedar Hollow stretched before them, a single main street lined with weathered storefronts and pickup trucks dusted with the first snow of the season. It was the kind of place that time had forgotten, nestled in a valley between mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against a steel-grey sky. Elena had never been here before, had chosen it precisely because it was nowhere, because it was the last stop on the cheapest bus route she could find, because it was far from the gleaming offices and manicured lawns of the Hartwood family estate, where she had been told she was no longer welcome. She looked down at Lily, just 7 years old, her dark hair escaping from beneath a knitted cap that was too small and too worn, her eyes wide with a confusion she was too young to fully understand. How do you explain to a child that the people who were supposed to be family have cast you out like garbage? That the grandmother and grandfather she had known her whole life had looked at her mother with cold eyes and said she was dead to them? You don't explain it. You simply hold her hand tighter and promise yourself that you will find a way to make it right. Elena had $40 in her pocket, a small duffel bag with clothes for both of them, and nothing else. No credit cards because those had been cancelled. No phone because that had been confiscated. No friends to call because the Hartwoods had made sure over the years that Elena's world shrank to include only them, a gilded cage she hadn't recognized until the door slammed shut with her on the outside. She had refused to sign the documents. That was her crime. Documents that would have transferred her late husband Michael's share of his grandparents' estate directly to the Hartwood family trust, cutting out his elderly parents who lived on a fixed income and desperately needed the inheritance their grandson had intended for them. Michael had been dead for 2 years now, killed in a car accident that Elena still couldn't think about without feeling the ground tilt beneath her feet, and his family had waited a respectable amount of time before revealing their true nature. "Sign the papers," Eleanor Hartwood had said, her smile as cold as the diamond brooch on her lapel. "And you and Lily will be taken care of. Refuse, and you will have nothing." Elena had refused. She had thought of Michael's gentle parents, of the promise she had made to him before he died to look after them, and she had refused. The next morning, she and Lily had been escorted off the property by security guards, their belongings thrown into a taxi, the iron gates closing behind them with a finality that echoed in Elena's chest. Now she stood in Cedar Hollow with her daughter shivering beside her, and no idea what to do next. She spotted a small general store across the street, its windows glowing with warm light, and she led Lily toward it, the bell above the door chiming as they entered. The shop smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and behind the counter stood an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a bun, and eyes that assessed Elena, with a shrewdness born of decades in a small town. Elena asked if there was anywhere in town they could find shelter, a boarding house perhaps, or a room for rent. The old woman's face darkened, the lines around her mouth deepening. "There's nothing in town," she said slowly, her voice carrying a warning. "But up on the mountain, there's the old Whitmore estate. Been abandoned for 30 years. Folks say it's cursed, that tragedy lives in those walls." Elena felt Lily press closer to her side. She asked how to get there. The old woman's eyes held hers for a long moment before she pointed a gnarled finger toward the window, toward the mountain that loomed above the town, its peak lost in clouds. "Straight up that road," she said, "but I wouldn't go there if I were you. No one who goes to that place stays the same." Elena thanked her and led Lily back out into the cold. She looked up at the mountain, at the path that wound into the darkness of the pines. She had no choice. They had nowhere else to go. The mountain road was a serpent of ice and shadow, winding upward through a forest of ancient pines whose branches bent low under the weight of snow and silence. Elena carried Lily on her back for the steeper sections, her boots slipping on patches of black ice that hid beneath the fresh powder, like traps waiting to be sprung. The duffel bag hung from her shoulder, its strap cutting into her flesh, but she didn't dare set it down, because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant dying. The temperature had plummeted with the sun, and now the cold was a living thing that wrapped around them with greedy fingers, searching for any gap in their clothing, any exposed skin to claim. Lily's arms were locked around her mother's neck, her face buried against Elena's shoulder, her small body trembling with a violence that terrified Elena more than the darkness or the ice, or the unknown that waited at the top of this forsaken road. She talked to Lily as they climbed, a steady stream of words meant to comfort and distract, telling her about the warm fire they would build, and the hot soup they would make, and the soft bed where they would sleep, safe and sound. She didn't know if any of it was true, didn't know what they would find at the end of this road, but the words kept coming, because silence would mean surrender, and Elena had not come this far to surrender. The forest pressed close on either side, the trees so thick that the last light of dusk barely penetrated their ranks, and the only sounds were Elena's labored breathing and the crunch of her boots on the frozen ground, and somewhere far away, the mournful cry of an owl. She had been walking for over an hour when the trees suddenly fell away, and the road opened onto a clearing, and there before her, rising from the snow like a nightmare given form, stood the Whitmore estate. Elena stopped, her breath catching in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mansion was enormous, a sprawling Victorian structure that must have been magnificent in its day, but now stood as a monument to decay and abandonment. 3 stories of dark wood and darker windows climbed toward a roof that sagged dangerously under the accumulation of 30 winters, its peaks and gables encrusted with ice that glittered in the faint moonlight like a crown of frozen tears. The windows were shattered, empty sockets that stared out at the world with blind malevolence, and the walls were strangled by dead vines that clawed at the wood like skeletal hands, trying to pull the whole structure down into the earth. A tower rose from one corner, its spire tilted at an angle that defied gravity, and the wide porch that wrapped around the front of the house had collapsed in several places, its railings broken and its boards rotted through. Snow covered everything, softening the edges of the decay, but also emphasizing the profound stillness of the place, the absolute absence of life, or warmth, or welcome. This was not a house. This was a tomb. Elena stood at the rusted iron gate that marked the entrance to the property, her hands gripping the frozen bars, and for a long moment she couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to take her chances in the forest, or on the road, or anywhere but here. Because this place was wrong, in a way she could feel in her bones. But then Lily shivered against her back, a convulsive tremor that shook her whole body, and Elena heard her daughter's teeth chattering so hard she feared they might crack. She looked at the mansion again, at its dark windows and sagging roof and skeletal vines, and she made her choice. There was no other shelter on this mountain. There was no going back down the road in the dark and the cold. There was only forward, only through, only this decaying monument to someone else's tragedy. She pushed against the gate, the frozen hinges shrieking in protest, the sound echoing across the clearing, like a warning, or perhaps a welcome. The gate swung open just wide enough for her to slip through, and she walked up the snow-covered path toward the porch, toward the front door that hung slightly ajar, as if the house had been waiting for them all along. She climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each board before putting her weight on it, and she pushed the door open and stepped inside, leading her daughter into the only shelter they had, praying that whatever waited within was better than what they had left behind. The darkness inside the mansion was absolute, a thick, suffocating blackness that swallowed them the moment they crossed the threshold. Elena fumbled in her duffel bag with numb fingers until she found the small flashlight she had packed, clicking it on and sending a weak beam of light into the void before them. What the light revealed made her stomach clench with despair. The entrance hall was vast, a cathedral of decay that stretched upward into shadows the flashlight could not penetrate. Frost coated every surface like a second skin, glittering on the walls and the floor, and the remnants of what had once been elegant furniture. Sheets draped over chairs and tables had rotted into grey rags that hung like shrouds over the skeletal forms beneath, and the floorboards were warped and buckled from decades of moisture, freezing and thawing in an endless cycle of destruction. Elena stepped forward carefully, testing each board before committing her weight, and the wood groaned beneath her boots like a living thing in pain. Lily clung to her hand, her small fingers like ice, even through her mittens, and Elena could hear her daughter's breath coming in short, frightened gasps that clouded in the beam of the flashlight. She swept the light across the walls and found portraits hanging in ornate frames, their subjects obscured by layers of frost and grime, their eyes following the intruders from behind veils of ice. A grand staircase dominated the far end of the hall, its banisters carved with intricate designs, now furred with frost, its steps climbing upward into a darkness so complete it seemed to devour the very concept of light. Elena had no intention of exploring the upper floors tonight, because what she needed was warmth, and she needed it now, because Lily's shivering had become a constant violent tremor, and her lips in the flashlight's glow had taken on a bluish tinge that spoke of hypothermia's first stages. She moved through the entrance hall into what must have been the main living area, a room of grand proportions with high ceilings and tall windows now opaque with ice, and there against the far wall she found what she was looking for. A massive stone fireplace dominated the room like an altar, its hearth wide enough to roast an ox, its mantel carved with images of mountain flowers and forest animals. The hearth was filled with debris, old birds' nests and fallen masonry, and the desiccated remains of some small creature that had crawled in to die, but the flue appeared intact and the stonework solid. Elena set down the duffel bag and went to work with desperate efficiency, born of fear, clearing the hearth with her bare hands, ignoring the filth and the cold that bit at her fingers, then gathering fuel from the mansion's wreckage. Broken chairs and table legs and pieces of wooden moulding provided plenty of dry material, and she stacked the wood in the hearth with the smallest pieces at the bottom, just as her father had taught her a lifetime ago. She found matches in her bag and struck one with trembling fingers, touching it to the kindling and watching the flame catch, tentative at first, then growing stronger. Smoke curled upward into the flue, and for a terrifying moment Elena feared it would billow back into the room. But then the draught caught and pulled the smoke upward and out into the night. She built the fire carefully, until flames cast a warm orange glow across the frozen room, the heat pushing back against the cold like a physical force. Elena pulled Lily close and wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her until the violent shivering began to subside. They sat like that for a long time, mother and daughter huddled together before the fire, the darkness held at bay by that small circle of light and warmth. It was Lily who saw it first. She lifted her head from Elena's shoulder and pointed at the fireplace, at the stones forming the back of the hearth. "Mama, look," she said, her voice small and curious. "Those stones are different." Elena leaned forward and examined where her daughter was pointing. The hearth was constructed of old river stones, rounded and grey, and fitted together with ancient morit, but there in the centre was a section that stood out from the rest. These stones were more uniform, more deliberately placed, and the mortar holding them was darker and newer than the crumbling material surrounding it. Someone had opened this hearth and sealed it back up again long after the original construction. Elena stared at those newer stones, the fire crackling beside her, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Elena moved closer to the hearth, her eyes fixed on the section of stonework that Lily had noticed, and in the dancing firelight, the difference became even more apparent. The original construction was the work of a master mason, river stones fitted together with precision that had held for over a century. But this newer section was cruder, hastier, the work of someone who wanted to hide something quickly rather than build, something to last. She reached out and pressed her fingers against one of the stones, expecting solid immovability, but instead the stone shifted beneath her touch, grinding slightly against its neighbors. Her heart began to beat faster as she worked her fingers around the edges, finding gaps where the mortar had been applied too thin, and she pulled gently at first, and then with more force until the stone came free, with a scrape that echoed through the empty room. Behind it was darkness, a void in the chimney where there should have been solid masonry, and Elena set the stone aside and reached into the opening with trembling fingers. The space was larger than she expected, a compartment carved deliberately into the interior of the chimney, and a hand closed around something soft and dry that crinkled slightly at her touch. She pulled it out into the firelight and found herself holding a leather satchel, old but remarkably well preserved, protected from moisture and cold by its hiding place within the stone. Lily pressed close to her side, her earlier fear forgotten in the excitement of discovery, and together they watched as Eleanor unfastened the brass clasp and opened it to reveal the contents within. There were documents, a thick stack of yellowed papers covered in dense legal text, and official stamps, and signatures rendered in ink that had faded to brown with age. There was a journal bound in dark leather, worn smooth by handling, its pages filled with neat feminine script that spoke of education and care. And there were photographs, a dozen or more, printed on thick cardstock in the style of decades past, their images slightly faded, but still clear enough to make out the subjects they portrayed. Elena spread the documents on the floor before the fire and began to examine them, her brow furrowing as she parsed the legal language. They were property deeds, she realized, deeds and surveys, and title transfers for the Whitmore estate, tracing ownership back through generations. There were also more recent documents, letters from attorneys and notices from the county, all addressed to a woman named Margaret Whitmore. Elena picked up one of the photographs and studied it in the firelight. It showed a woman standing on the porch of this very mansion, though in the image the house was alive with fresh paint and gleaming windows and flower boxes overflowing with blooms. The woman was perhaps 50 years old, handsome rather than beautiful, with intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw. On the back of the photograph, written in the same hand as the journal, were the words, "My home, my legacy, my burden." Elena opened the journal and turned to the first page, where an inscription read, "The Private Journal of Margaret Whitmore, begun in the year 1989. She flipped through the pages, catching glimpses of entries that spoke of daily life on the estate, of loneliness and determination, of someone named Richard who appeared again and again in passages marked by fear and anger. The final entry was dated 30 years ago, and though Elena wanted desperately to read every word, her eyes were burning with exhaustion, and Lily had begun to droop against her side, the warmth of the fire finally allowing sleep to claim her. Elena carefully gathered everything and returned it to the satchel, her mind racing with questions. Who was Margaret Whitmore, and what had happened to her? Why had these papers been hidden, and what were they meant to prove? She knew this discovery was significant, knew it in her bones, but she also knew she needed rest and daylight, and a clear head to understand what she had found. She tucked the satchel into her duffel bag and arranged their meager bedding before the fire, pulling Lily close. Tomorrow she would read the journal and study the documents and try to understand why this place had been abandoned. But tonight she would sleep, grateful for warmth and shelter. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls, and Elena closed her eyes, the satchel pressed against her chest, like a promise of things to come. Dawn came slowly to the frozen mansion, grey light seeping through the ice-covered windows, and revealing the full extent of the decay that darkness had mercifully hidden. Elena woke with her back stiff, and her breath still clouding in the cold air, the fire having burned down to embers during the night, and she added more wood and coaxed the flames back to life before carefully extracting herself from Lily's sleeping embrace. Her daughter stirred, but did not wake, exhaustion holding her in its grip, and Elena tucked the blankets tighter around her small form before rising to explore their shelter in the unforgiving light of day. The main hall looked even worse than it had the night before, the frost and rot and ruin impossible to ignore. But Elena forced herself to move through it with purpose, searching for anything that might help them survive. She found the kitchen at the back of the house, a large room with a flagstone floor and a massive wood-burning stove that dominated one wall like a cast-iron beast. The stove was covered in rust, and the pipes that connected it to the chimney were corroded. But when Elena opened the firebox door and peered inside, she saw that the structure was sound, that with cleaning and effort it might work again. Copper pots hung from hooks on the wall, green with verdigris, and a pump handle over the sink suggested there might be a well, though when she worked the handle, nothing came but a dry, gasping sound. She moved on to the library, a room lined floor to ceiling, with shelves that had once held hundreds of books, but now held only ruin, the volumes swollen and rotted by moisture that had seeped through the walls over decades, their pages fused together into solid bricks of pulp. A few books on the highest shelves had survived, and Elena made a mental note to retrieve them later, but for now she continued her exploration. The conservatory stopped her in her tracks. It was a beautiful room, or had been once, a glass-walled space that jutted from the back of the house, and must have been filled with plants and sunlight and life. Now the glass was cracked and opaque with grime, and the plants that had once thrived here had frozen and died, and then frozen again, year after year, until their expanding ice-filled forms had shattered the pots that held them and burst through the tables that supported them in an explosion of terracotta and frozen soil. It was devastation, complete and total, and yet Elena stood in the doorway and felt something an unexpected rise in her chest. Hope, because beneath the decay she could see the bones of something beautiful, the craftsmanship and care that had gone into building this home, the love that had filled these rooms before tragedy emptied them. This house had been someone's dream, someone's life work, and it could be again. She returned to the main hall, where Lily still slept, and retrieved Margaret Whitmore's journal from the satchel. She sat before the fire and began to read from the beginning, and the voice that emerged from those yellowed pages was sharp and clear and deeply sad. Margaret wrote of her isolation on the mountain, of the townspeople who feared her and whispered behind her back, of the loneliness that pressed in on her like the winter cold. But most of all, she wrote of someone she called only him at first, and then later by name, Richard, a man who wanted what she had, who smiled with charm while his eyes calculated value, who would not stop until he had taken everything from her. "He came again today," one entry read, "with his lawyers and his false concern, and I saw in his face that he will never relent. He wants this land, and he wants me gone from it, and I fear what he will do when he realizes I will never surrender." Elena read those words and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, because she knew that kind of man, knew him intimately, and she was beginning to understand that the story of Margaret Whitmore and her own story were more connected than she could have imagined. Elena turned the pages of the journal with growing dread, each entry pulling her deeper into Margaret Whitmore's world of fear and isolation. The early entries had been marked by loneliness and quiet determination, but as the months progressed, the tone shifted into something darker, something desperate. Margaret wrote of sleepless nights and shadows at the edge of the property, of phone calls where the line went dead when she answered, of letters from attorneys demanding she respond to claims she had never heard of. And through it all, one name appeared again and again, circled in ink, underlined, written with a pressure that nearly tore through the paper. Richard Hartwood. He was her nephew, Margaret explained, the son of her estranged sister who had married into the Hartwood family and adopted their values of wealth and acquisition above all else. Richard had first appeared at the estate when Margaret was in her 40s, a young man in an expensive suit with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, expressing concern for his aging aunt living alone on the mountain. He had offered to help manage her affairs, to take the burden of the estate off her shoulders, and when she had politely declined, he had returned again and again, each visit more insistent than the last. "He speaks of family duty and filial love," Margaret wrote, "but I see the way he looks at this land, at these walls, at everything my father and grandfather built. He does not see a home. He sees an asset to be liquidated, a number on a ledger, and he will not rest until it belongs to him." The entries detailed a campaign of pressure that escalated over years. Richard brought lawyers who presented documents for her to sign, transfers and easements and powers of attorney that would have stripped her of control over her own property. When she refused, he brought county officials who cited violations and demanded inspections, and when those tactics failed, he brought threats, veiled at first, and then increasingly overt. He spoke of her mental competence, of the dangers of a woman her age living alone, of how easy it would be for an accident to happen on this isolated mountain, and no one would know for days. "He has connections everywhere," Margaret wrote in an entry that made Elena's hands tremble. "The sheriff plays cards with him on Thursdays. The county assessor is married to his cousin. The judge who would hear any case I might bring has received donations from Hartwood accounts for 20 years. I am surrounded, and he knows it, and he smiles that terrible smile, because he believes it is only a matter of time." Elena read the name again, Richard Hartwood, and felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. She knew that name. She knew that smile that never reached the eyes, that charm that masked calculation, that patience that was really just a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Richard Hartwood was her father-in-law, the patriarch of the family she had married into, the man who had sat at the head of the table at every holiday dinner and told stories of his business acumen and his family's proud legacy. He was the man who had handed her the documents to sign after Michael's death, the documents that would have cheated Michael's grandparents, And when she had refused, he had looked at her with those cold eyes, and told her she would regret it. The Hartwoods had not cast her out simply because she had defied them. They were connected to this place, to this woman who had vanished 30 years ago, to whatever dark secret these walls contained. Elena looked up from the journal and stared into the fire, her mind racing with implications she was only beginning to understand. She had come to this mountain by chance, or so she had thought, but now she realized that chance had nothing to do with it. She was sitting in the home of a woman who had faced the same enemy she faced, who had fought the same fight she was fighting, and who had disappeared without a trace. The question that burned in her mind was simple and terrifying. What had Richard Hartwood done to Margaret Whitmore? And what would he do when he learned that Elena had found her secrets? Elena read on through the journal with a growing sense of urgency, the fire crackling beside her as Lily continued to sleep, and the story that unfolded in Margaret's careful handwriting was one of a woman who had known she was running out of time and had taken desperate measures to protect what she loved. Margaret had consulted with an attorney in a distant city, someone beyond the reach of Hartwood influence, and had drawn up a new will that would circumvent everything Richard had planned. The original will, written years earlier, had named Richard as heir simply because there was no one else, but this new document revoked that bequest entirely and replaced it with something far more specific. I leave the Whitmore estate and all its contents to any future descendant of the Whitmore bloodline who will restore this home to its former glory and honor the family name, Margaret had written, and Elena read those words twice to make sure she understood them. The will went on to specify that if no such descendant came forward within 50 years, the property would pass to a conservation trust to be preserved as a historic site. But under no circumstances was Richard Hartwood, or any member of his family, to inherit so much as a single stone from these walls. Margaret had known exactly what she was doing, had crafted a document that would deny Richard his prize, and ensure that her home would either be loved or protected, but never exploited. She had signed the will in the presence of witnesses, and had it notarized with all proper legal formality, and then she had brought it back to the estate, and hidden it in the one place she knew Richard would never think to look. I have placed the will and the original deed in the chimney behind the hearthstones, Margaret wrote, sealed in oilskin to protect against moisture and fire. If anything happens to me, I pray that someday someone will find them and know the truth. Richard believes he has won, but I will not let him take this place. Not while I draw breath, and not after. The entries that followed were shorter, more fragmented, the writing of a woman whose fear had begun to overwhelm her careful composure. She wrote of strange cars parked at the base of her road, of footprints in the snow that were not her own, of phone calls in the middle of the night where she could hear breathing on the other end before the line went dead. And then came the final entry, dated November 15th, 30 years ago, to the month. And Elena felt her throat tighten as she read the words. He is coming tonight. I know it with a certainty I cannot explain. I have seen the lights on the road, and I have heard the engines, and I know that Richard has finally decided to end this. I have hidden everything that matters. I have done all I can do. If anyone reads these words, know that I did not abandon this place. Know that I loved it until my last breath. And know that Richard Hartwood is a monster who will stop at nothing to get what he wants. God help me. There was nothing after that. No more entries. No explanation of what had happened that night. Just blank pages that spoke louder than any words could have. Elena closed the journal and held it against her chest, her heart pounding, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had discovered. She held proof that Margaret Whitmore had changed her will, that the Hartwoods had no legal claim to this estate, and that Richard had been present on the night Margaret vanished. She held proof of conspiracy, of fraud, perhaps of something far worse, and she knew with absolute certainty that if the Hartwoods discovered what she had found, They would come for her, just as they had come for Margaret. And this time, they would make sure that no evidence survived. Elena sat before the fire with the journal in her lap, and the weight of 30 years of secrets pressing down on her shoulders. And she knew with cold clarity that she could not go to the authorities with what she had found. Margaret's own words echoed in her mind, the descriptions of a sheriff who played cards with Richard Hartwood, of county officials who owed their positions to Hartwood money, of a network of power and influence that had allowed one woman to vanish without a trace and her estate to sit frozen in time for 3 decades. That network still existed. Elena was certain of it, because the Hartwoods did not abandon their investments, and they did not forget their debts. If she walked into the county sheriff's office with these documents and this journal, she would be walking into the lion's den, and the evidence would disappear just as Margaret had disappeared, and Elena and Lily would follow. She needed a different strategy, a way to establish herself before she revealed what she knew. And as she looked around the ruined main hall of the Whitmore estate, the answer came to her, with a clarity that felt almost like fate. She would stay. She would restore this mansion, make it livable, make it hers, in fact, if not yet in law. And only when she had established a legitimate presence that could not be easily erased would she bring Margaret's secrets into the light. It was a desperate plan, perhaps a foolish one, but it was the only plan she had. And Elena had learned long ago that desperate times did not wait for perfect solutions. She woke Lily and explained that they were going to stay here for a while, that they were going to fix up this old house and make it their home. And Lily looked up at her with those trusting eyes and nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They began that very morning, starting with the most essential tasks, the things that would keep them alive and warm as the winter deepened. Elena found tools in a shed behind the house, rusted but serviceable, and she set to work boarding up the broken windows with planks salvaged from collapsed furniture, sealing out the wind that cut through the rooms like knives. Lily helped by holding the boards in place, while Elena hammered, her small hands steady and her face set with concentration. And Elena felt a fierce pride in her daughter's courage. They swept the main hall clear of debris, piling the broken glass and fallen plaster and desiccated leaves into mounds that they carried outside. And with each load, the room looked less like a tomb and more like a space where people might actually live. They reinforced the fire, building a proper stack of wood that would last through the night. And Elena showed Lily how to bank the coals and add fuel and keep the flames alive, skills that might save their lives if anything happened to Elena. The work was grueling, far harder than anything Elena had done in her years as a Hartwood wife, and by the end of the first day her hands were blistered and her back ached, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But there was something else too, something she had not expected, a sense of purpose that burned in her chest like the fire in the hearth. She was not just surviving anymore, not just running from the people who had cast her out. She was building something, creating something, fighting for something that mattered. Lily felt it too. Elena could see it in the way her daughter attacked each task with determination, in the way she smiled when they completed a job, in the way she looked around the main hall as the sun set and said that it looked better already. They ate a simple meal of canned soup heated over the fire, and then curled up together in their nest of blankets, exhausted but not defeated. And as Eleanor closed her eyes, she made a silent promise to Margaret Whitmore and to herself. She would restore this home. She would honor this legacy, and she would make the Hartwoods pay for what they had done, no matter how long it took. Elena left Lily at the mansion with strict instructions to stay by the fire and not open the door for anyone. And then she began the long walk down the mountain toward town, her boots crunching on the frozen road and her breath clouding in the bitter morning air. She had counted her remaining money 3 times and knew that $40 would not go far. But they needed food and they needed basic supplies. and she had no choice but to face whatever reception awaited her in Cedar Hollow. The walk took over an hour, and by the time she reached the main street, her feet were numb and her cheeks were raw from the wind, but it was the stairs that cut deepest. The townspeople saw her coming and stopped what they were doing to watch, their conversations dying mid-sentence, their eyes following her with a suspicion that bordered on hostility. She heard the whispers starting before she had taken 10 steps down the sidewalk, voices low but not low enough, and the words that reached her ears were like small stones thrown at her back. "That's the one staying at the Whitmore place. Doesn't she know what happened there?" Some people never learn. Eleanor kept her head high and her eyes forward, and walked into the general store. The same one where she had spoken to the old woman on her first day, but this time the person behind the counter was different. He was an elderly man with a weathered face and thick white hair, and hands that were gnarled from decades of hard work, and he looked up when she entered, and his expression immediately hardened into something cold and unwelcoming. She approached the counter and placed her small list on the wooden surface, asking for flour and salt and canned goods and matches, and the man looked at the list and then looked at her and did not move to fill the order. "You're the one living up at the Whitmore place," he said, and it was not a question. Elena met his gaze and said that she was. The man shook his head slowly, his mouth set in a grim line. "I'm Samuel Brennan," he said, "and I've owned this store for 40 years, and in all that time I've seen 3 families try to make something of that place on the mountain. They all left, one way or another, and not one of them left happy. That place brings nothing but misery, and I won't be party to helping another fool walk into that trap." Elena felt the anger rise in her chest, but she forced it down, forced herself to speak calmly and clearly, because she could not afford to make an enemy of the only store in town. She told Samuel that she understood his concern and that she appreciated his warning, but that she and her daughter had nowhere else to go, that they had been cast out by people who should have protected them, and that the Whitmore estate was the only shelter they had. She told him that she was not looking for misery, that she was looking for a chance to build something, to make a home for her child, and that she would face whatever came, because the alternative was giving up, and she did not know how to do that. Samuel studied her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes searching her face as if looking for something specific, and whatever he found there seemed to soften something in him. He sighed and reached for the list, and without another word he began to gather the items she had requested, placing them in a paper bag with movements that were slow, but not unkind. When he told her the total she paid with her precious bills, and gathered the bag in her arms, and she was almost to the door, when his voice stopped her. "Be careful up there," Samuel said, and when she turned he was watching her with an expression that was equal parts warning and something that might have been respect. Powerful people have long memories in these mountains, and they don't like it when someone disturbs what they thought was buried. You watch yourself, and you watch that little girl of yours. Elena nodded and thanked him and walked out into the cold, and as she began the long climb back up the mountain, she turned his words over in her mind, wondering how much he knew and how much he suspected, and whether he might one day be an ally or just another obstacle in her path. Elena returned to the mansion with the supplies clutched against her chest, and a growing unease settling in her stomach, and as she climbed the final stretch of the road, she felt it for the first time, that prickling sensation at the back of her neck that told her she was being watched. She stopped and turned, her eyes scanning the tree line that bordered the property, and for a moment she saw nothing but the dense ranks of snow-covered pines standing silent and still. Then movement caught her eye, a shape that was there and then was not, a figure stepping back into the shadows with a quickness that spoke of practice, and by the time her mind registered what she had seen, the trees were empty again, and the only sound was the wind. She stood frozen for a long moment, her heart hammering, and then she forced herself to move, to walk the rest of the way to the mansion and get inside where Lily was waiting. She told herself it might have been an animal, a deer, or a hunter passing through. But she knew even as she formed the thought that it was a lie. Someone had been watching her, and they had not wanted to be seen. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep by the fire, Elena sat in the darkness with her back against the wall and listened to the sounds of the old house settling around her. The wind moaned through the gaps in the boards she had nailed over the windows, and somewhere upstairs a shutter banged rhythmically against its frame. But these were sounds she had grown accustomed to, sounds that belonged to the mansion. The sound she heard just after midnight did not belong. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the wooden boards of the front porch. Elena was on her feet instantly, her hand closing around the hammer she had kept beside her, and she moved to the door and pressed her ear against the cold wood, and heard nothing. No breathing, no movement, only the wind and the creak of old timber. She waited for what felt like an eternity, and then she lifted the bar she had placed across the door and opened it just wide enough to look out, and the porch was empty, the snow on the steps undisturbed except for a single set of footprints that led up to the door, and then away again, disappearing into the darkness. The Hartwoods knew she was here. She understood that now with a certainty that left no room for doubt, and she understood too that they were letting her know they knew, that the watcher in the trees and the footsteps on the porch were messages, warnings, the first moves in a game she had not chosen to play, but could not afford to lose. She would not be caught unprepared. She worked through the rest of the night while Lily slept, her hands moving with a desperate energy that drove away exhaustion. She fashioned locks from old hardware she found in the shed, bolts and latches that she mounted on the doors, and windows, crude but functional barriers that would at least slow an intruder. She pushed the heavy bookshelf in the library away from the wall and discovered a space behind it, a gap between the shelf and the corner that was invisible from anywhere else in the room, and she wrapped Margaret's documents and journal in oilskin and tucked them into that hiding place where they would be safe, even if the mansion was searched. She checked every window, every door, every possible point of entry, and she made mental notes of which boards creaked loudest underfoot, so she would know if someone was moving through the house. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, she had done everything she could think of to secure their position, and she sat down beside Lily and watched her daughter sleep, and made a silent vow that whatever the Hartwoods sent against them, they would find her ready. She had survived their cruelty once, and she would survive it again, and when the time came, she would make them answer for Margaret Whitmore, and for every person they had ever crushed beneath their ambition. But first she had to live long enough to fight. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Elena had not expected, a pattern of work and rest, and small victories that began to feel almost like a life. She and Lily woke each morning before dawn, coaxing the fire back to life and sharing a simple breakfast of whatever they had, and then they set to work on the mansion, with a determination that grew stronger with each passing day. They cleared debris from room after room, hauling out the detritus of 30 years of abandonment, the fallen plaster and broken glass, and desiccated leaves that had blown in through shattered windows and accumulated in drifts against the walls. They scrubbed floors on their hands and knees with rags and water heated over the fire, watching the wood emerge from beneath layers of grime, seeing the rich grain and warm color that had been hidden for so long. They repaired what they could with the limited tools Elena had found, rehung doors that had fallen from their hinges, replaced broken boards with salvaged lumber, sealed cracks and gaps with rags and paper, and anything else that would keep out the cold. The work was exhausting, far harder than anything Elena had ever done, and by the end of each day her body ached and her hands were raw and every muscle screamed for rest. But with each room they cleared, each floor they scrubbed, each repair they completed, the mansion changed a little more, shedding its shroud of decay and revealing glimpses of the beauty that lay beneath. Warmth began to return to rooms that had been cold for decades, not just the physical warmth of the fire they kept, burning, but a different kind of warmth, a sense of life and presence and care that pushed back against the gloom. Lily felt it too. Eleanor could see the change in her daughter as clearly as she could see the change in the house. In the first days, Lily had been frightened of the dark halls and the strange sounds and the shadows that seemed to move in the corners of her vision, clinging to Elena's side and refusing to venture beyond the main room where the fire burned. But as they worked together, as Lily saw the results of their labor, something shifted in her. She began to explore on her own, wandering into rooms they had cleared, running her small hands over surfaces they had cleaned, looking up at ceilings they had swept free of cobwebs, with an expression of wonder that made Eleanor's heart swell. She began to see what Eleanor saw, not the ruin, but the potential, not the decay, but the bones of something beautiful waiting to be restored. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lily announced that the house needed a name, because you couldn't live somewhere that didn't have a name. And after much deliberation, she declared that it would be called Whitmore House, because that was the name of the lady who had lived here before, and it was only right to remember her. Elena agreed, and from that moment on, they referred to their home by its proper name. And somehow that small act of naming made it more real, more theirs. Lily began to draw pictures of what Whitmore House would look like when they were finished, crayon sketches on paper Elena had bought in town, showing the mansion with gleaming windows and a repaired roof, and flowers growing in boxes along the porch, and smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney. She drew herself and Elena standing in front, holding hands, smiling, and she taped the pictures to the wall above their sleeping place, where they could see them every night before they closed their eyes. Elena looked at those drawings and at her daughter's face, bright with hope, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest like a flame. Lily had lost so much already, her father, her home, the family she had thought loved her, and she had come to this frozen mountain with nothing but her mother's hand to hold. Now she was finding hope again, finding joy in the work of restoration, finding a future in the walls of this old house, and Elena knew that she would do anything to protect that hope. She would fight the Heartwoods, she would fight the whole world if she had to, because her daughter believed that good things were possible, and Elena would die before she let anyone take that belief away. The sound of an engine laboring up the mountain road came on a grey afternoon, when Elena was on the roof, attempting to patch a hole that had been letting snow into one of the upstairs bedrooms. She climbed down immediately, her heart pounding with alarm, because no one came up this road except those who meant them harm. And she positioned herself on the porch with the hammer in her hand, and Lily safely inside. But the truck that emerged from the trees was not the sleek vehicle of the Heartwoods, or the official car of some county inspector come to drive them out. It was an old pickup, rust-spotted and practical, its bed loaded with supplies covered by a tarp, and behind the wheel sat Samuel Brennan from the general store, his weathered face set with an expression of determination that Elena did not understand. He parked in front of the house and climbed out slowly, his joints stiff from the cold, and he stood looking up at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I knew Margaret Whitmore," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion or might have been the mountain air. "Knew her when I was young, before she closed herself off from the town, before Richard Heartwood started his campaign to take everything she had. She was a kind woman, generous with what she had, always ready to help a neighbor in need, and she did not deserve what happened to her. The town knew what Heartwood was doing to her, knew he was pressuring her and threatening her, and trying to steal her home out from under her, and we did nothing. We were afraid of his money and his connections, and what he could do to us if we spoke up. And so we stayed silent, and one day Margaret Whitmore was gone, and we all pretended we didn't know why. Elena stood on the porch with the hammer still in her hand, not sure what to say, not sure what this confession meant, or what Samuel wanted from her. He turned to the truck and began pulling back the tarp, revealing what he had brought. There were stacks of firewood, split and seasoned and ready to burn. There were tools, real tools, a saw and a proper hammer, and a level and a box of nails. There were bags of food, flour and sugar, and dried beans and canned vegetables, enough to last weeks. Elena stared at the supplies and felt something crack open in her chest, something she had kept tightly sealed since the day the Heartwoods had cast her out. She asked Samuel why he was doing this, and he met her eyes with a directness that reminded her of Margaret's voice in the journal. "Because I made a mistake 30 years ago," he said, "and I have to live with that every day. Because I saw you in my store, and I saw something in you that I saw in Margaret, a strength that won't bend, and I'll be damned if I stand by and watch it happen again. Because powerful men like Richard Heartwood count on the rest of us being too afraid to do the right thing, and I'm too old now to be afraid anymore." He offered to help with the restoration, to bring supplies when they needed them, and to lend his hands and his knowledge to the work of making Whitmore House a home again. Elena felt tears burning in her eyes, and she blinked them back because she had not cried once since leaving the Heartwood estate, and she would not start now. But the offer of help, the first kindness anyone had shown her in months, broke through defenses she had not known she was holding. She accepted, her voice thick, and Samuel nodded as if he had expected nothing less. Over the following days he became their ally, arriving several times a week with his truck and his tools and his quiet, steady presence. He told Elena stories of the estate's history, of the Whitmores who had built it, and the generations who had lived here. And he told her what he remembered of Margaret, her paintings, and her garden, and her fierce independence. He became a bridge to the town, speaking to the other residents about Elena and Lily, slowly shifting the narrative from suspicious outsiders to neighbors deserving of respect. And Elena, who had thought she would have to fight this battle entirely alone, began to understand that even in the shadow of the Heartwoods there were people willing to stand up, people who had been waiting for someone to show them it was possible. The work transformed with Samuel's help, accelerating from the slow, desperate labor of two people with nothing into the purposeful effort of a team with proper tools and knowledge. Samuel arrived each morning with his truck loaded with materials he had salvaged or purchased, glass panes from abandoned buildings and lumber from a mill that owed him a favor, and shingles he had stored in his barn for years, waiting for the right use. And together they tackled the jobs that Elena could never have managed alone. They started with the roof, climbing up on ladders that Samuel brought, and replacing the rotted sections that had been letting in snow and rain for decades, laying new shingles in careful overlapping rows that would shed water and hold against the mountain winds. The work was dangerous and exhausting, perched on the steep pitch with the valley spread out far below, but with each section they completed, Elena felt the house grow stronger, more solid, more capable of protecting them against whatever might come. They replaced the broken windows next, carefully removing the shattered panes, and fitting new glass into the old frames, sealing them with putty that Samuel showed her how to apply. And when they finished, and Elena stood inside, looking out through clear glass for the first time, she felt tears prick her eyes at the simple miracle of being able to see the world without a barrier of grime and ice. The wood-burning stove in the kitchen was Samuel's particular project, and he spent 3 days cleaning out the firebox and replacing corroded pipes and adjusting the dampers until the old iron beast roared back to life, filling the kitchen with a warmth that reached into every corner and made it possible to cook real meals instead of heating cans over the fireplace. The mansion began to change in ways that went beyond the physical repairs, shedding its atmosphere of death and decay, and taking on something that felt almost like hope. Rooms that had been tombs became spaces where light entered and warmth gathered, where Eleanor and Lily could sit and talk and even laugh without feeling like intruders in a place that wanted them gone. It began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home, and Elena understood that this was what restoration really meant, not just fixing what was broken, but bringing back the life that had once filled these walls. Samuel talked while they worked, sharing memories of Margaret Whitmore that painted a picture of a woman Elena wished she could have known. Margaret had been an artist, he told her, a painter of landscapes who captured the mountains in all their moods and seasons, and her work had hung in galleries in the city before she retreated to the estate and stopped showing her paintings to anyone. She had taken in stray animals, dogs and cats, and once an injured hawk that she nursed back to health and released, and she had helped struggling families in the town with quiet generosity, paying medical bills and buying groceries, and never asking for recognition or thanks. She had been proud and independent and fierce in her convictions, and when Richard Hartwood had come for her home, she had stood alone against him, refusing to bend, refusing to break, refusing to give him what he wanted no matter how much pressure he applied. She stood alone, Samuel said, his voice heavy with old regret. And we let her. Elena listened to these stories and felt a kinship growing in her heart, a connection to this woman she had never met, but whose fight she had inherited. She understood what it meant to be targeted by the powerful, to have wealth and influence arrayed against you, to stand alone against forces that seemed insurmountable. Margaret had faced Richard Hartwood and had not surrendered, and Elena would do the same. She would finish what Margaret had started, and she would make sure that the truth came out no matter what the Hartwoods did to stop her. She owed that to Margaret, and she owed it to herself, and she owed it to Lily, who deserved to grow up in a world where the powerful could not simply take what they wanted without consequence. The car that came up the mountain road on a cold, bright morning was nothing like Samuel's battered truck, and Elena knew the moment she saw it that the temporary peace they had enjoyed was over. It was a black sedan, sleek and expensive, its polished surface gleaming in the winter sun, and it pulled to a stop in front of Whitmore House with the quiet authority of wealth that expected to be obeyed. Elena set down the board she had been measuring and wiped her hands on her jeans, her heart beginning to pound as a man emerged from the driver's side. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark wool coat that probably cost more than everything Elena owned, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his face arranged in an expression of professional pleasantness that did not reach his pale eyes. He approached the porch where Elena stood and introduced himself as Robert Crane, a representative of the Hartwood family's legal interests, and he spoke the words as if they should mean something to her, as if the name Hartwood was supposed to make her tremble. He told her that she was trespassing on private property, that the Whitmore estate belonged to the Hartwood family through a legally recognized inheritance, and that she and her daughter needed to vacate the premises immediately or face arrest for criminal trespass. He delivered this information with the calm certainty of a man who had done this many times before, who was accustomed to people folding at the first mention of legal consequences, and he clearly expected Elena to do the same. She felt the fear rising in her chest, the old familiar terror of being powerless against people who held all the cards, but she forced it down and met his eyes, and spoke in a voice that was steady, even though her hands wanted to shake. She told him that she had documentation suggesting the ownership of this estate was very much in dispute, that the inheritance he referenced might not be as legally sound as the Hartwoods believed, and that she would not leave this property until the matter was properly resolved through legitimate legal channels. She watched his face as she spoke and saw the pleasant mask slip, saw the hardness emerge beneath it, and she knew that her words had landed exactly where she intended them to land. Crane's voice lost its professional warmth and took on a cold edge that was closer to his true nature. He told her that she was making a terrible mistake, that the Hartwoods did not lose, that they had resources and connections she could not possibly imagine, and that people who stood against them always regretted it in the end. He told her that this was her only warning, that if she was still here when he returned, she would face consequences far worse than arrest, and he let the threat hang in the air between them, unspecified but unmistakable. Then he turned without waiting for a response, and walked back to his expensive car, and drove away down the mountain, leaving Elena standing on the porch with her heart pounding and her hands finally trembling now that he was gone. She went inside and found Lily watching from the window, her small face pale with worry, and Elena knelt and took her daughter's hands, and told her that everything was going to be fine, that some people were trying to scare them, but they were not going to let themselves be scared. She said the words with all the conviction she could muster, but inside she knew that this visit was only the first move, that Crane would report back to Richard Hartwood, and the real pressure would begin, and that whatever came next would be worse than polite threats delivered by a man in an expensive coat. She thought of Margaret Whitmore, standing alone against this same family 30 years ago, thought of the journal entries filled with fear and determination, and she understood now what Margaret had felt in those final days. But Eleanor was not alone. She had Lily, and she had Samuel, and she had the truth hidden behind the bookshelf, and she would not run, and she would not break, and she would not let the Hartwoods take this home the way they had taken everything else. Elena knew after Crane's visit that determination alone would not be enough, that she needed legal help if she was going to fight the Hartwoods on their own ground, but the thought of hiring a lawyer seemed almost laughable when she counted the few dollars she had left from her original 40. She mentioned her predicament to Samuel the next time he came to work on the house, expecting nothing more than sympathy, but instead he set down his tools and looked at her with an expression of careful consideration. "There's a young attorney in Millbrook," he said, "about an hour's drive east of here. Her name is Caroline Chen, and she's got a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers won't touch, cases against powerful people who think they're above the law. She doesn't always win, but she always fights, and she's been known to work for free when she believes in the cause." Elena felt a spark of hope flicker in her chest, fragile but real, and the next morning she left Lily in Samuel's care and made the journey to Millbrook in his borrowed truck. The town was larger than Cedar Hollow, with a proper main street, and a small courthouse, and offices where professionals conducted business, and Elena found Caroline Chen's practice in a modest building between a hardware store and a dentist's office. The attorney who greeted her was younger than Elena had expected, perhaps 30, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind simple glasses, and a no-nonsense manner that put Elena immediately at ease. She listened as Elena explained her situation, her expression neutral, and when Elena finished speaking, Caroline asked to see the documents. Elena had brought copies, leaving the originals safely hidden at Whitmore House, and she spread them on Caroline's desk and watched as the attorney began to examine them. At first, Caroline's face remained skeptical, the look of someone who had heard many desperate people make claims they could not support. But as she read through Margaret's will and compared it to the property records and studied the journal entries describing Richard Hartwood's campaign of pressure, her expression changed. She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes moving faster across the pages, and Elena saw the moment when professional interest transformed into something deeper, something that looked almost like hunger. "This is extraordinary," Caroline said quietly, almost to herself. "If these documents are authentic, if the will can be verified, then the Hartwood claim to the estate is fraudulent, and the entire inheritance they've built on it is legally void." She looked up at Elena with an intensity that was almost fierce. She told Elena that she would take the case, that she would work on contingency, with no payment unless they won. But she also issued a warning that Elena needed to hear. The Hartwoods would not go quietly. They would use every tool at their disposal to crush this challenge before it could threaten them. And those tools included money and connections, and a willingness to destroy anyone who stood in their way. They would attack Elena's character, her fitness as a mother, her mental stability. They would pressure anyone who helped her. They would make her life a misery in ways large and small, and they would not stop until she either won or broke. Elena listened to the warning and felt the fear coiling in her stomach. But beneath the fear was something harder, something that had been forged in the months since the Heartwoods had cast her out into the cold. She told Caroline that she understood the risks, that she had already lost everything once and survived, and that she would not back down no matter what the Heartwoods did. She had no other choice, she said, because if she ran now they would win, and Margaret Whitmore would never have justice, and Lily would grow up knowing that her mother had surrendered to the people who had tried to destroy them. Caroline studied her for a long moment, and then nodded, and Elena saw respect in the attorney's eyes. "Then we fight," Caroline said, and she began to outline what they would need to do to bring the Heartwoods down. The Heartwoods struck back with a coordinated fury that confirmed everything Elena had read in Margaret's journal about their methods, and within a week of Caroline filing the initial challenge to their ownership claim, Elena found herself besieged on all sides. It began with the county inspectors, 2 men in official jackets who arrived unannounced and spent 3 hours examining every inch of Whitmore House, taking photographs and making notes and shaking their heads with theatrical concern. They cited violations Elena had never heard of, structural deficiencies and fire hazards and sanitation issues, and they condemned the building as uninhabitable and ordered her to vacate within 7 days or face criminal charges for endangering a minor. Eleanor asked for copies of their reports and was told they would be mailed, and when she asked what agency they represented, they gave her a card with a phone number that, when she called it later, rang and rang without answer. The newspaper story appeared 3 days after that, a front-page article in the Cedar Hollow Gazette that painted Elena as a mentally unstable drifter who had illegally occupied the Whitmore estate and was raising her daughter in conditions of dangerous squalor. The article quoted unnamed sources who expressed concern for the child's welfare and suggested that social services should intervene, and it included a photograph of the mansion taken from an angle that emphasized its decay, while carefully excluding the repairs Elena and Samuel had completed. Elena read the article with shaking hands and felt a rage so pure it nearly blinded her. Because they were using Lily, using her daughter as a weapon against her, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. The anonymous threats began the same week, notes left at the gate in the middle of the night, typed on plain paper with no signatures, warning her to leave while she still could, and suggesting that accidents happened to people who did not know their place. One note mentioned Lily by name, describing her routine, the times she played outside, and the path she walked when she went to meet Samuel's truck, and Elena felt her blood turn to ice as she understood that they were watching, that they knew everything, that they could reach her daughter whenever they chose. She felt the walls closing in around her, the same coordinated campaign of harassment that Margaret had described 30 years ago, the same relentless pressure designed to break her will and drive her away. And she understood now how Margaret must have felt in those final weeks, alone and afraid and running out of options. But Elena did not break. She took the inspector's citations and the newspaper article and the threatening notes, and she photographed them all and wrote detailed accounts of every incident, every date and time and circumstance, and she sent copies to Caroline with instructions to document everything in case something happened to her. She called the newspaper and demanded a retraction, and was told that the story was based on reliable sources and would stand, and when she asked for the names of those sources, she was met with silence. She contacted the county offices to appeal the condemnation, and was transferred from department to department, until she finally reached a clerk who told her the matter was under review, and hung up. She did all of this while continuing the restoration work, rising each morning and picking up her tools and making progress on the house that was supposed to break her, refusing to give the Hartwoods the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She told Lily that some people were trying to make them leave, but that they were not going to let those people win, and Lily nodded with a seriousness beyond her years and went back to sweeping the floor she had been working on. Elena watched her daughter and felt the determination harden in her chest like iron, because they could send their inspectors and publish their lies and leave their threats at her gate. But they could not make her quit, and as long as she was standing, she would fight. The fever came on suddenly, transforming Lily from a bright-eyed child, helping with the restoration, into a shivering, whimpering figure, huddled beneath every blanket Elena could find. It started with a cough that Elena dismissed as dust from their work, then progressed to chills that would not stop no matter how close to the fire she held her daughter. And by the second night, Lily's forehead was burning hot, and her eyes were glassy and unfocused, and she was calling out for her father in her delirium. Elena had never been so frightened in her life, not when the Hartwoods cast her out, not when Crane delivered his threats, not when the anonymous notes appeared at the gate. She bundled Lily into Samuel's truck and drove down the mountain faster than was safe on those icy roads, her knuckles white on the steering wheel and prayers she had not spoken in years tumbling from her lips. The clinic in Cedar Hollow was small, but the doctor was competent, a middle-aged woman who examined Lily with gentle hands and diagnosed a respiratory infection brought on by stress and exposure to cold. She administered antibiotics and fluids and told Elena that Lily would recover, but the look she gave Elena over her glasses was not reassuring. She told Elena that children needed stability and warmth and consistent care, not construction sites and legal battles, and the kind of stress that suppressed immune systems and made small bodies vulnerable to illness. She asked Elena point-blank whether her fight for the mansion was worth her daughter's health, and Elena had no answer, because the question cut straight to the heart of every doubt she had been pushing down for weeks. She drove back up the mountain with Lily sleeping fitfully in the passenger seat, and felt despair settling over her like a physical weight. Maybe the doctor was right. Maybe she was being selfish, putting her own need for justice ahead of her daughter's well-being, dragging Lily through hardship after hardship, because she was too proud to walk away. The Hartwoods had resources and power, and 30 years of practice at destroying anyone who challenged them. And what did Eleanor have? A crumbling mansion and a pile of old documents, and a stubbornness that might just get her daughter killed. She carried Lily inside and put her to bed in the warmest corner of the main room, piling blankets over her small form and stoking the fire until the flames roared. And then she sat beside her daughter and watched her sleep, and felt the tears finally come, sliding down her cheeks in the flickering light. She had tried so hard to be strong, to never let Lily see her waver, but now in the quiet of the night, with her daughter sick and the walls of the mansion pressing in around her, she let herself feel the full weight of what she had taken on, and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. It was then that she noticed the drawing. It was tucked beneath Lily's pillow, a piece of paper that must have slipped out when Elena moved her, and she pulled it free and held it up to the firelight, and felt her breath catch in her throat. Lily had drawn the two of them standing in front of Whitmore House, but not the Whitmore House of today, with its decay and damage. This was the mansion as it would be when they finished, with gleaming windows and a repaired roof, and flowers in boxes along the porch, and smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney. Elena and Lily stood in front, holding hands, smiling, and above them in careful crayon letters were the words, "Our Home." Elena stared at the drawing and felt something shift inside her, felt the despair crack and fall away, and something harder take its place. Lily believed in this. Lily saw what they were building, not just walls and roof, but a future, a place where they belonged, a home that no one could take from them. Elena folded the drawing carefully and pressed it against her heart, and made a vow in the silence of the night She would finish this. She would make that drawing real. And she would do it for Lily. Caroline's call came on a morning when Elena was beginning to lose hope, when the weight of the inspector's citations and the newspaper lies and the anonymous threats had piled so high she could barely see over them, and the attorney's voice on the other end of the line was vibrating with an excitement that Elena had not heard before. "I found something," Caroline said. "Something big, and you need to come to my office right away." Elena left Lily with Samuel and made the drive to Millbrook with her heart pounding, not daring to hope, but unable to stop herself. And when she arrived, Caroline was waiting with documents spread across her desk and an expression of fierce satisfaction on her face. She had been digging through county records, she explained, searching for any irregularities in the Hartwood claim to the Whitmore estate, and what she had found was far worse than irregularities. It was fraud, systematic and deliberate, a paper trail of lies that stretched back 30 years to the moment Margaret Whitmore disappeared. The Hartwoods had filed paperwork declaring Margaret deceased just 3 months after she vanished, claiming that she had no living heirs, and that Richard Hartwood, as her closest relative through his mother's side, was entitled to inherit the estate. But the death certificate they had submitted was never properly validated, Caroline explained, pointing to a document on her desk. There was no body, no investigation, no official determination of death by any competent authority. The certificate was signed by a single physician who happened to be a Hartwood family friend, and it was accepted by a probate judge who had received campaign contributions from Hartwood accounts for years. The entire legal claim to the property was built on a foundation of fraud, and if they could prove it in court, the Hartwoods would lose everything. But that was not the most important discovery, Caroline continued, and her eyes were bright with something that looked almost like triumph. She had been researching the Whitmore family tree, tracing the bloodlines that Margaret had referenced in her will, and she had found something extraordinary. Margaret had left the estate to any future descendant of the Whitmore bloodline who would restore the home and honor the family name, and Caroline had discovered that such a descendant existed. Elena's late husband, Michael, had been born Michael Whitmore before his mother remarried, and he took his stepfather's name. And his grandmother had been a cousin of Margaret's father, making Michael a direct descendant of the Whitmore line. Elena stared at Caroline as the implications sank in, her mind racing to keep up with what she was hearing. If Margaret's will was authenticated and the Hartwood claim was invalidated, then Michael would have been the rightful heir to the Whitmore estate, and since Michael was dead, his inheritance would pass to his next of kin. To Lily, her daughter was not a trespasser or a squatter or any of the things the newspaper had called her. She was the legal owner of Whitmore House, the descendant Margaret had hoped for, the person who was meant to restore the home and carry on the family name. Elena felt tears streaming down her face and did not bother to wipe them away, because for the first time since this nightmare began, she could see a path to victory, a way to defeat the Hartwoods, not just morally, but legally, completely, finally. Caroline warned her that the fight was far from over, that they still had to authenticate Margaret's will and prove the fraud in court and overcome whatever obstacles the Hartwoods threw in their path. But the case was stronger than either of them had imagined. They had evidence of crimes that could send Richard Hartwood to prison, evidence that could strip the family of their ill-gotten property and restore it to its rightful owner. Elena drove back to Whitmore House with the setting sun, painting the mountains gold and red, and when she arrived, she found Lily helping Samuel stack firewood, and she swept her daughter into her arms and held her tight. "This is your home," she whispered into Lily's hair. "It was always supposed to be your home, and I am going to make sure you get to keep it." The black car that came up the mountain 3 days after Caroline filed the formal challenge was not driven by a representative or a lawyer, but by Richard Hartwood himself. And Elena knew it the moment he stepped out, because she had seen that face at 100 family dinners, had watched those cold eyes calculate value and weakness across holiday tables for years. He was in his 70s now, his silver hair impeccably groomed, and his posture rigid with the authority of a man who had never been told no in his life. And he walked toward the mansion with the slow, deliberate stride of someone who owned everything he surveyed. Elena met him on the porch, her chin raised and her hands steady at her sides, and she did not invite him inside. Richard stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her with an expression of weary contempt, as if she were an insect that had crawled onto his dinner plate. He told her that she was destroying herself for nothing, that she had no idea who she was dealing with, that he had connections in every courthouse and police department in the state, and that her little lawsuit would be crushed before it ever saw the inside of a courtroom. He told her that he was offering her a gift, a chance to walk, away with money in her pocket instead of being ground into dust, and he named a sum that would have seemed enormous to the Elena, who had arrived in Cedar Hollow with $40. All she had to do was leave, and never speak of Margaret Whitmore again. Elena looked at the man who had tormented Margaret and stolen her home, and quite possibly done far worse, and she felt nothing but cold clarity. She told him no. She told him that she knew what he had done, and that she had proof, and that she would see him answer for it if it was the last thing she did. Richard's composure cracked, the mask of civilized authority splitting to reveal something ugly beneath, and his voice dropped to a hiss as he told her she would regret this, that she had no idea what he was capable of, that she and her daughter would pay for her arrogance. Then he turned and walked back to his car and drove away, and Elena stood on the porch and watched him go and felt her heart pounding with fear and triumph in equal measure. That night, she woke to absolute darkness. The fire burned down to coals, and the electric lights she had rigged with the generator completely dead. She pulled on her coat and went outside with a flashlight, and found the generator behind the house, its fuel line cut clean through, gasoline pooled on the frozen ground. They had come in the night while she and Lily slept, had crept onto the property and sabotaged their power, and crept away again. And the message was clear. Richard Hartwood was done with warnings. Eleanor refused to let the sabotage break her, and the morning after she discovered the cut fuel line, she was on the phone with Samuel before dawn, and by midday he had arrived with replacement parts, and a determination that matched her own. They repaired the generator together, and then went further, installing motion-sensing lights around the perimeter and rigging an alarm system from bells and wire that would alert them if anyone approached the house at night. Samuel brought his nephew, a young man who worked in security, and he helped them identify the vulnerable points and create a patrol routine that would make it harder for the Hartwoods to strike unseen. The restoration continued despite the threats, Elena and Lily and Samuel working side by side to repair and rebuild, and with each passing day, Whitmore House grew stronger and more defiant. Word of what was happening on the mountain began to spread through Cedar Hollow and beyond. The story of a woman who had stood up to the Hartwoods and refused to be crushed, and something remarkable started to happen. People began to come. They arrived in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups, driving up the mountain road with trucks full of supplies and tools and food. Some were strangers who had heard the story and wanted to help, but others were people Elena recognized from town, people who had once stared at her with suspicion and whispered behind her back. They came with lumber and nails and glass, panes with canned goods and fresh bread and warm clothes for Lily. And they came with something else, too. They came with stories. One by one they told Elena what the Hartwoods had done to them. The businesses bankrupted by sudden code violations, the farms lost to disputed property lines, the careers destroyed by whispered rumors and closed doors. They told her of loved ones who had been crushed and silenced, of injustices that had festered for years because no one dared speak up, and they told her that watching her fight had given them hope that maybe the Hartwoods were not invincible after all. The mansion became something more than a restoration project, more than a legal battle over property rights. It became a symbol of resistance, a gathering place for the forgotten and the wronged, a declaration that ordinary people could stand together against the powerful and refuse to be moved. Elena watched her neighbors working on the house that had once frightened them, watched them sharing meals and stories and laughter in rooms that had been silent for 30 years, and she felt something shift in her understanding of what she was doing. She had come to this mountain alone and desperate, fighting for survival, and nothing more. But somewhere along the way, the fight had grown beyond her. She was not alone anymore. She had an army. Caroline filed the lawsuit on a crisp Monday morning, submitting a meticulously prepared case to the state court and that challenged the Hartwood claim to the Whitmore estate, and presented Margaret's will as evidence of systematic fraud spanning 3 decades. The filing was accompanied by a press release that Caroline sent to every major news outlet in the region, and within hours, the story had exploded beyond anything Elena had anticipated. Journalists descended on Cedar Hollow, knocking on doors and asking questions, and they found a town full of people eager to talk after years of enforced silence. The story of Elena and Lily and the frozen mansion was compelling enough, but it was the pattern of Hartwood abuses that turned it into a sensation, the exposed web of land acquisitions and political influence and crushed opponents that stretched back generations. Former employees came forward with accounts of being threatened into silence. Business partners revealed deals that had been enforced through intimidation, and county officials who had long served Hartwood interests began to distance themselves as the spotlight grew too bright for comfort. The carefully constructed reputation that Richard Hartwood had spent a lifetime building began to crumble, each new revelation another crack in the foundation, and for the first time in his long career of domination, he found himself on the defensive. Elena watched the news coverage with a mixture of vindication and fear, because she knew that a cornered animal was the most dangerous kind, and Richard Hartwood was nothing if not an animal beneath his polished exterior. The signs of his desperation became visible even from a distance, reports filtering back to her of erratic behavior and explosive outbursts, of meetings where he screamed at his own lawyers and threatened journalists with destruction. He filed counter-motions and demanded sanctions and accused Caroline of prosecutorial misconduct, but the tactics that had always worked before seemed to bounce off walls that were no longer there, and each failed maneuver only made him look more guilty. His children began to distance themselves from the family business, his allies in county government stopped returning his calls, and the empire he had built on fear and silence started to look very fragile indeed. Elena knew the battle was far from over, knew that Richard still had money and connections, and a lifetime of experience at destroying his enemies. But she also knew that something fundamental had shifted. The Hartwoods were no longer untouchable. The truth was coming out, and every day it spread further and grew stronger, and there was nothing Richard could do to stop it. The knock came late on the night before the court hearing, soft and hesitant, nothing like the aggressive pounding Elena had learned to expect from Hartwood messengers. She approached the door with caution, her hand on the makeshift weapon she kept nearby, but when she opened it, the person standing on the porch was the last one she expected to see. Eleanor Hartwood looked diminished somehow, smaller than Elena remembered her, the imperious matriarch who had presided over family dinners with cold authority, now wrapped in a plain coat with her silver hair escaping from beneath a scarf, her face pale and drawn in the moonlight. She asked if she could come in, her voice barely above a whisper, and Elena stepped aside without a word and let her enter. Eleanor looked around the main hall of Whitmore House, at the restored floors and the repaired windows, and the fire burning warmly in the hearth, and something flickered across her face that might have been surprise, or might have been grief. She told Elena that she was not there to threaten or to offer deals or to deliver any message from Richard, that in fact Richard did not know she had come, and would be furious if he found out. She was there to warn her. Richard was planning something, Eleanor said, something drastic, though she did not know exactly what. He had been making phone calls late at night, speaking in low, urgent tones, and destroying notes afterward, and he had that look in his eyes that Eleanor had seen before when he was about to do something terrible. He had never lost anything in his life, she explained, had never been denied anything he wanted, and he did not know how to accept defeat. The lawsuit and the media attention and the crumbling of his reputation had driven him to a place beyond reason, and Eleanor was afraid of what he might do to protect himself. She paused then, her hands twisting together, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with something that sounded like decades of suppressed guilt. She told Elena that she had suspected for years that Richard was involved in Margaret Whitmore's disappearance, that she had seen the way he talked about Margaret, and the obsessive attention he paid to this property, and the satisfaction in his eyes when word came that she was gone. She had never had proof, had never dared to look for proof, and she had told herself that suspicion was not the same as knowledge, and that her duty was to her husband and her family. But she had known, somewhere deep inside, where she did not let herself look. She had known that Richard had done something unforgivable, and she had kept silent for 30 years while he enjoyed the fruits of his crime. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key, old and slightly tarnished, and she pressed it into Elena's hand. She had found it hidden in Richard's study, she explained, taped to the back of a drawer where he thought no one would look, and she had discovered that it belonged to a storage unit in a facility in the next county, a unit that had been rented under a false name and paid for in cash for 3 decades. She did not know what was inside, but she knew that Richard had guarded that key like his life depended on it, and she believed that whatever Elena was looking for might be there. Eleanor stepped back towards the door, her warning delivered, her betrayal complete, and she looked at Elena with eyes that were wet with tears she would not let fall. She begged Elena to be careful, to protect herself and Lily, because Richard was capable of things that Eleanor could not bring herself to name. Then she slipped out into the night as quietly as she had come, and Elena stood alone in the doorway, holding the key that might finally unlock the truth of what had happened to Margaret Whitmore and what the Hartwoods had been hiding all these years. Elena called Caroline before dawn and told her about Eleanor's visit and the key, and within 2 hours they were driving together to the storage facility in the next county, a nondescript building on the outskirts of a town neither of them had ever visited. The unit was in a back corner, away from the main office, and when Elena slid the key into the padlock and felt it turn, she held her breath, not knowing what she would find, but certain that it would change everything. The door rolled up with a screech of metal on metal, and the morning light fell on a space-packed floor-to-ceiling with boxes and covered objects, the accumulated secrets of 30 years waiting in the darkness to be found. They worked methodically, opening boxes and documenting contents, and what they discovered was a trove of evidence more complete than Elena had dared to hope. There were boxes of documents related to the Whitmore estate, deeds and surveys and legal correspondence that traced the history of the property and the Hartwood efforts to acquire it, and among them was the original deed that Richard had claimed was lost, the document that proved the chain of ownership, and that he had hidden rather than destroyed, because even he could not bring himself to eliminate such a valuable piece of paper. There were personal effects belonging to Margaret Whitmore, items that should have been in the mansion, but had been removed and stored here where no one would find them, and Elena felt tears on her cheeks as she uncovered Margaret's paintings wrapped in cloth, landscapes of the mountains she had loved rendered in colours that still glowed with life after 3 decades in darkness. There were letters Margaret had written to friends, letters that spoke of her fear and her determination, and there was a locket on a gold chain that contained a photograph of Margaret as a young woman, beautiful and hopeful, with her whole life ahead of her. Elena held the locket in her hand and felt the weight of the woman who had worn it, the woman who had fought so hard and lost so much, and she made a silent promise that Margaret's story would finally be told. But it was the final box that contained the most damning evidence of all, a collection of correspondence between Richard Hartwood and various local officials that laid bare the conspiracy in black and white. There were letters discussing how to pressure Margaret, how to use code violations, and legal threats to force her off her property. And there were later letters, dated just before Margaret's disappearance, discussing how to handle the Margaret problem in terms that were chillingly vague and clearly understood by both parties. One letter in particular made Elena's hands shake as she read it, a message from Richard to the county sheriff discussing the need for decisive action and promising that there would be no questions asked and no evidence found. It was not a confession to murder, not explicitly, but it was close enough that any prosecutor would know what it meant, and combined with the fraudulent death certificate and the hidden will and the storage unit full of Margaret's belongings, it painted a picture of conspiracy and cover-up that pointed to something far worse than property fraud. Caroline photographed everything, her face pale, but her hands steady. And when they had documented the entire contents of the unit, they loaded the most critical evidence into her car and drove straight to the state police headquarters, bypassing the local authorities that the Hartwoods had corrupted. They presented their findings to a detective who listened with growing astonishment, and by the end of the day a team had been dispatched to secure the storage unit, and Richard Hartwood's name had been added to an official investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and suspicion of involvement in the disappearance of Margaret Whitmore. Elena walked out of the police station into the late afternoon sun and felt something loosen in her chest, a knot that had been there for months finally beginning to release. The truth was out. The authorities had it, and whatever happened next, the Hartwoods would never be able to bury Margaret's story again. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the hearing, every seat filled with townspeople and journalists and former victims of the Hartwoods who had come to witness what they hoped would be a reckoning decades in the making. Elena sat at the plaintiff's table with Caroline beside her, and across the aisle, Richard Hartwood sat with his team of expensive lawyers, his face a mask of contempt that did not quite hide the desperation in his eyes. Caroline presented their case methodically, introducing Margaret's authenticated will, the fraudulent death certificate, the expedited probate overseen by a compromised judge, and the damning correspondence from the storage unit. She called witnesses who testified to the Hartwoods' pattern of intimidation, townspeople, and former employees who told their stories of being threatened and silenced, and who refused to look away from Richard as they spoke. The weight of evidence was overwhelming, and Elena watched Richard's face as his world collapsed around him. It happened during Caroline's closing argument, when she spoke of Margaret's courage and the justice she deserved. Richard rose from his seat, face purple with fury, and began to shout. "She deserved what she got," he screamed. "She should have just signed the papers." The courtroom erupted as bailiffs moved forward and took him by the arms, but he kept shouting, confessing in his rage what he had hidden for 30 years. The judge restored order and delivered her ruling with cold finality. She declared the Hartwood claim null and void, Margaret's will valid, and Lily the rightful heir to the Whitmore estate. Richard Hartwood was taken from the courtroom in handcuffs, placed in custody pending investigation into Margaret Whitmore's disappearance. And as the doors closed behind him, Eleanor felt a weight lift that she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Months later, Whitmore House stood transformed against the clear blue sky, its roof repaired and its windows gleaming in the sunlight, smoke rising from the chimney in a cheerful curl that spoke of warmth and life within. The gardens that had been choked with weeds and buried under snow were being restored, beds of rich earth waiting for spring planting, and the conservatory that had once held only frozen death was now filled with new plants, green and growing, their leaves pressing against the cleaned glass as if eager to greet the sun. Elena stood on the porch with Lily beside her, looking out at the mountains that had once seemed so hostile and forbidding, and now felt like the only home she had ever truly known. The townspeople who had come to help them in their darkest hour had become friends and family, a community bound not by blood, but by shared struggle and triumph. And they gathered often at the mansion to share meals and stories and the simple joy of being together. Caroline's car came up the road that afternoon, and the attorney stepped out with news that made Elena's heart clench with bitter-sweet relief. The investigation into Richard Hartwood had led to the discovery of Margaret Whitmore's remains buried on Hartwood property, and the man who had taken everything from her would now face justice for her death as well as his fraud. Margaret would finally rest in peace, her story told, her legacy honored, her home restored by the descendant she had hoped for, but never lived to see. Elena held Lily close and felt tears on her cheeks, tears of grief for the woman she had never met, and tears of gratitude for everything that woman had given her. She had come to these mountains with nothing, disowned and desperate, $40 in her pocket and nowhere to go. But she had found something more valuable than any wealth the Hartwoods possessed. She had found purpose in the restoration, community in the people who stood with her, and a legacy to pass on to her daughter. The frozen mansion was now filled with warmth and light, a testament to the power of resilience and the truth that no one is ever truly alone.